Oftentimes in our society, we perceive the world through what we most commonly hear, the dominant narratives. Many opinions and voices are overshadowed by what society wants to believe, not the truth. The book, 21 Things You Didn't Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph, dives into a complex and deeper understanding of the true power of counter-narratives. His book takes us on an inspiring journey that sheds light on important Indigenous counter-narratives, which were hindered by the government and the true reality of the horror Indigenous peoples had to confront. Empowerment arises from resistance to these dominant narratives, highlighting the power of reclaiming one's own story to restore dignity, identity, and justice. Bob Joseph discusses many elements regarding unfair treatment towards Indigenous peoples. However, one he touches on is an essential part of the disintegration of power and control over them: governance and independence. He writes that each nation had its own distinctive political institution, traditions, leadership system, economy, culture, and had autonomous control over its territories and resources within. The author clearly explains to us how Indigenous nations had effectively sustained and governed themselves. He uses the word distinctive to show that each nation was sovereign and self-governing, demonstrating fully functioning societies. The dominant narrative often states that Europeans brought order and structure into Canada, while the counter-narrative here expresses that this is false. This connects back to the empowerment of counter-narratives by demonstrating evidence that fully combats the dominant narrative, painting a new picture of how Europeans lied about their gift of order and civilization to Canada, and instead the image where they shoved and excluded those already in full power to bring about their preferred lifestyle. Secondly, an important counter-narrative Bob writes about is the disruption of Indigenous lifestyles and mistreatment towards them. Specifically, he exposes the negative changes in the treatment of Indigenous women and the effects that these changes had on Indigenous culture. He states, prior to European contact and the ensuing fundamental disruption to the traditional lifestyle of Indigenous communities, women were central to the family. They were revered in communities that identified as matriarchal societies, had roles within community government and spiritual ceremonies, and were generally respected for the sacred gift bestowed upon them by the Creator. Here, he points out a counter-narrative by glancing at the Indigenous lifestyle before the arrival of settlers, accentuating the importance of a woman in a family and, in general, respecting them with gifts and honor. By using the word prior, he clearly explains the effect of Europeans, emphasizing that not only did they interrupt the lifestyles of Indigenous communities, but also made it harder and difficult for them to live and function as a peaceful society. By presenting this information, Joseph once again empowers readers with another counter-narrative against Europeans and settler colonialism. Through an attack on the dominant narrative that Europeans civilized Canada and created a structure, Bob makes it evident that Europeans destroyed traditional lifestyles, disrupted Indigenous women, and ruined their position in families and communities. Lastly, he presents another extremely important piece of information, which delves into another truth that has been hidden by dominant narratives. The Indigenous author writes, "A reserve is a tract of land set aside under the Indian Act and treaty agreements for the exclusive use of an Indian band. At least, that's how a reserve is described on paper. In reality, reserves were created as a means of containing and controlling Indians while providing European settlers full access to the fish and game, water, timber, and mineral resources that had formerly sustained Indian life and culture." He exposes how the reserves were used to the advantage of Europeans to gain valuable resources and to give them control and power over the land of Indigenous peoples. The dominant narrative hid this concept, and it made Europeans seem like better people by portraying them as saviors and home providers, while this was not the case. He uses the word reality to show that what is said is not always true, and the dominant narrative that many believe is far off from the truth. Through this counter-narrative, he empowers and triggers a sense of recognition in his readers, prompting them to question the actions in the past and the equality and privilege given to Indigenous peoples. Through his writing and analysis of his passages, it is evident that Bob Joseph has successfully used counter-narratives to broaden our perception of past events toward Indigenous peoples and the truth behind the Indian Act. By discussing the impact on governance and independence, traditional lifestyle, and restriction of resources, he creates powerful counter-narratives that empower his readers and present views and important perspectives that have been hidden by dominant narratives. Ultimately, as he exposes these counter-narratives, it challenges us to question whose stories we've been told and whose voices we still need to hear. Thank you.